Hey there, welcome to the Thriving and Wellness Podcast with Haley and Caitlin. This podcast is for women who are tired of just surviving and ready to truly thrive. It's time to reclaim your health and build trust in your body.
Join us as we mythbust nutrition topics, tackle your mindset, and dive into the nerdy side of women's health. Just a reminder that this is meant for educational purposes only and is not meant to be used for medical diagnosis or treatment. Now let's jump in. Hello, welcome back to the Thriving and Wellness Podcast. Today we are talking about intermittent fasting. And I first want to start off by kind of clarifying what intermittent fasting is, because even though I feel like that's what everybody calls it, that's only one of the types of fasting. So intermittent fasting is really more of where you're having your restricted eating on 2 non-consecutive days of the week. So you could do like Tuesday and Friday, where you're eating less than 500 calories a day. And then the other 5 days of the week, you're not following any sort of calorie restriction whatsoever. And then I think what we more traditionally think of as intermittent fasting is actually considered time-restricted feeding. And this is where you're only eating for typically like 8 hours of the day, and then you're fasting for the other 16 hours. And then you're doing that every single day of the week.
Mm-hmm. Is it just me, or do you have some, does time restricting feeding sound weird to you? Like for cattle or something? I don't know. Time restricted eating. Anyways. Yeah, I think
time.
Yeah, most people would say, anytime I talk to someone and they say intermittent fasting, I don't think I've ever had someone do the 5-2 where they're actually like doing different diets, different days.
My mom did the 5-2. That I feel like that's what I know that one so well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe some like really dedicated people, but the average person, usually not, because intermittent fasting is just used so interchangeably. So what we want to talk through today is why we don't always recommend this. Some of the benefits that you could get from it, also some of the cons, downsides, maybe consequences, and how, if at all, we utilize this in our practice.
Yep. And because we're so focused on getting in tune with your body and really listening to your body, that's of course one of our biggest reasons why we don't usually recommend intermittent fasting. And we're going to kind of just use that interchangeably for the most part for, both the 5-2 style and then that like time restricted eating. But it doesn't really allow you to listen to your own body's hunger cues when you're forcing yourself to eat only within, like 8 hours of your day, when hopefully we're, awake for significantly longer amounts of time than just 8 hours.
Yeah. And I think for most people, some people do this and they're flexible with it. So if they maybe say they don't eat until 1 o'clock normally, if they're hungry at 11, if you have a healthy relationship with food, I do see that people will like, okay, I'm really hungry. I need to just eat a little bit earlier today. But I also see the flip side where people will push it off. And then we get to this point where we're not hungry and maybe we should be eating around 1, then we're not eating till like 2 or 3. And then our body is running on stress hormones and the reserve fuel that we have. And by that point, if you've gone the entire night and most of the day, your body has burned through those glycogen stores. So you are for sure running on stress hormones at that point because your body is having to create that energy.
Yeah. Well, and then sometimes I'll see people, especially when they're like first starting intermittent fasting and they're like switching to like relatively normal eating and then really restricting their calories with this. If their like ending time is decently before they go to bed, they're like starving when they're trying to go to sleep at night because they haven't had enough time to eat enough during the day, and then it can disrupt their sleep because literally they're just hungry.
Yeah, and then and you're probably having some blood sugar drops too, some swings. So
Mhm.
that definitely can negatively impact your sleep. And then it just starts that vicious cycle of you're exhausted the next day. Maybe you're noticing the weight loss, which isn't, yeah, all the things, right? I'm wondering, maybe we switch things up a little bit, what you feel like, maybe we talk about some of the pros and cons of that first, and then we can talk through what we see and recommend.
Yeah. So some of the pros of intermittent fasting, we've seen that more with actually the like true intermittent fasting of like that where you're really restricting what you're eating for the two non-consecutive days of the week. We've seen more benefits with that in the research than the time restricted feeding. So there are some actual improvements with like insulin resistance and blood pressure and cholesterol and inflammatory markers. Um, so there is that research there, and that's looking in comparison to like a calorie restricted diet typically. So there are some true benefits with intermittent fasting.
Yeah, and I'm not totally against it. I think for a handful of people, and we'll talk about who we would typically recommend this for, it can be beneficial. But for the most part, I don't see people doing it correctly, with which
Hmm.
goes for like most most diets in general, most therapeutic diets. People with, if you're not having any sort of guidance, the way we're approaching it, and this is nothing against you guys if you've tried this, but
Of
it's
course.
just, it's difficult to do.
Mhm.
And the way we often see people using this is like, I'm just not going to eat until later in the day. And so it's an, if you already don't like breakfast, it's just another way to be like, oh, I don't need to eat breakfast. But the research I've seen too really more so supports eating earlier on in the day. So most of the research doesn't necessarily say wait until 1 o'clock to eat, but that's kind of become the trend because it's easier, and it's just kind of culturally what we do is dinner tends to be our largest meal. And
Mhm.
so really these benefits, so yes, the intermittent fasting where we're alternating days, but some of the stuff I've seen with actual time restricted eating too, it's you're eating earlier in the day and then reducing that intake later on when you're less
Mhm.
active, you're a little bit more insulin resistant. So kind of mimicking or eating with your circadian rhythm.
Yeah. I think a huge thing to point out is we have not seen any benefit with weight loss with time restricted feeding compared to calorie restriction. So both of those are going to provide a similar result.
Yeah. And if you're someone who started intermittent fasting, you're like, wait, but I lost weight. It might be because that put you into a calorie restriction because you had that structure, and it's
Right.
harder to eat quite as much food if you have that structure and you're not eating late into the night or whatever it might be. So that's what I often see happening. Some of the cons that we came across too is reduction in bone density and lean body mass, which is never something we want.
Right. Yeah. And for both of us, whenever we're helping somebody with weight loss, we're always trying to do it in such a strategic way that we're not losing any of that muscle mass. So we definitely see more of that with any sort of intermittent fasting.
Yeah. And so if you're not familiar with why you want to keep that lean body mass, I mean, you can go back and listen to our episodes on metabolism, but our muscle is going to require more energy. So the more muscle we have, the higher our metabolic rate is. So meaning more calories you need. And we want that. We want a higher metabolic rate. Everyone talks about boosting your metabolism. Well, keeping and building muscle mass is a key component of that. So we need to be strategic when it comes to weight loss to make sure we're targeting the fat loss versus muscle loss. All right, little technical difficulty there, but we're going to jump right back in and talk about who we recommend this for or not.
So I will sometimes recommend this for men or like postmenopausal women.
Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is, so in general, I'm on the same page. We typically don't recommend it for women in their reproductive years.
Mhm.
Not because we're fragile or anything like that, but our hormones are a little bit more sensitive to stressors. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So for men, their hormones are a little bit more consistent. And then the same for like postmenopausal women, they don't have those same fluctuations. And so the intermittent fasting might be beneficial in those cases.
Yep. And then like completely separate from that, I mean, very much in general, if you're on like a prescription medication, but really, if you're on something that's going to affect your blood sugar, like insulin or one of the GLP-1 medications or any of those like weight loss meds, you'd want to be really careful with that, because we don't want your blood sugar getting too low and causing problems.
Yeah, definitely that risk of hypoglycemia. So if you fit into that category and this is something you're considering, we highly recommend reaching out to your healthcare provider to talk to them, see if any adjustments need to be made. Make sure you're closely monitoring your blood sugar and everything. I want to talk a little bit more about what we do recommend is, say, a woman who comes to us, they were considering it intermittent fasting. What would you kind of lean towards as far as recommending for them?
Yeah, so I would not recommend that like 5-2 style where we're only eating 500 calories on a couple days a week.
That just sounds
Absolutely.
miserable anyways. Like
Yes, I did try it in college and it was miserable.
like those, you know, those 2 days out of the week, you're just gonna be like, I don't know, not functional and not want to do anything.
Right. And because they have to be on, I mean, not that anybody wants their weekends to like, you only have 500 calories. So I tried to do it like on a school day. And I remember like, I literally couldn't focus
Yeah.
on anything. It was miserable. So would not recommend that. But I would say like for the average person, I'm going to recommend fasting for about 12 hours overnight, but I'd be willing to push that to like 14 hours.
Mhm.
If somebody was wanting a slightly longer fasting period, but not all the way to like the 16 hours.
Yeah, and especially because the women that we are often working with are already burnt out. They're usually not even eating enough in general. And so we don't want to add more rules and restriction that are going to add more stressors, right? And then this isn't something we plan to talk about, but when you were just saying how you felt, like when you were doing the intermittent fasting, I think a lot of people actually experience the opposite. Like when they start intermittent fasting, they feel great. They feel like this, they feel rejuvenated, this newfound energy, and they're like, this is awesome. And that's because you are riding this adrenaline high. Like your body is producing more of those hormones. So you feel the energized. So often what I see is people, these women feel fantastic initially with that. But as they continue to do that, they start to get a little bit more burnt out. They're not noticing the same benefits of the increased energy anymore, but they're sticking with it because they felt like that was key initially. So like if I just do it harder, if I fast longer, then maybe I'll feel that again. But in that case, we'd actually recommend doing the opposite and making sure you're eating enough and consistently. So smaller meals throughout the day, making sure you're fueling consistently to keep that blood sugar stable. Because if you're in that burnout state, or maybe if you have some thyroid concerns, like your blood sugar might be a little bit more sensitive, or what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know what the word I'm looking for.
It's
Susceptible,
not as like
susceptible to lows.
um yeah, and just like to add on of why we don't usually recommend this for women when they are in that like reproductive time. Um, when we have all of this, the stress, like we're talking about the burnout period, just life.
Life, especially if
Uh,
you're a mom.
yes, for sure. But then like, I feel like there's a lot of this going around right now about like how exercise can even be a stressor. Um, and then being in a calorie restriction and intermittent fasting, like those would be stressors as well. And if we can't get rid of our children as our stressors, um, we don't want to do that. We love our
Yeah.
kids and
I mean,
our
there's a
spouse.
lot of stress we don't have control over. Let's be honest.
Exactly. But intermittent fasting, that's something more so that we can control. And with the exercise piece, there's just so many like really good benefits to exercise as well, that we don't want to have to pull that away as a stressor unless somebody is, like truly, truly to their absolute max and we have to pull everything out. Um, so this is kind of the place where we don't want to be adding in that additional stressor.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but I don't think there's ever a situation where I say like, don't move your body, don't exercise at all.
For
A
sure.
very rare case. With that, we're just strategic with what type of movement you do, because that, like the different levels of activity intensity, that can play to stress. And so that's similar here, is like, instead of doing this longer fasting period, we're saying, sure, there's still some benefits of giving your digestive tract a break, right? Not eating through the overnight hours, eating with the sun, but let's maybe not push it so long, right? So let's not push it to the point where it's detrimental stress.
Yes. And I feel like people ultimately want, yes, there's like this weight loss piece, but we've already talked about how between calorie restriction and intermittent fasting, there isn't a difference there. So if we're really trying to lose weight and ultimately just be healthier overall, it's really challenging to eat enough healthy foods in a really short amount of time, because healthier foods tend to be so much more bulky. There's a lot more volume to them, and it's simply difficult to eat that much food in a really short eating window.
Yeah, I've seen stories of, I don't know if they're like chiropractors or even MDs or something, that do like one OMAD, one meal a day, right? And they talk about how they're like literally sitting there eating for like an hour and a half, because it's like they have this massive meal to get adequate calories in, right? No one's got time for that. But also along that same line, like getting enough protein, going back to the lean body mass, like getting adequate protein in is crucial. And protein's filling. So to sit there and eat these massive quantities of protein in a small period of time, you're most likely not going to hit your protein goal there either. And I wonder if that's maybe part of what leads to that loss of lean body mass too.
Yep, I'm imagining, okay, 100 grams of protein.
You're probably just going to rely on a bunch of like protein supplements at that point, and that's not ideal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so then you're really moving away from eating whole foods, a nutritious diet. Like you're having to lean on so many processed foods to get the calories you need, and that's not ultimately healthy.
Yeah. So there's some cases where I've had clients utilize it and it's been beneficial. Oftentimes it's like a temporary thing, or like a therapeutic thing that we use, or for men and postmenopausal women, maybe doing a slightly longer fasting window, but still being strategic with it and making sure that your body's in a place that will respond favorably to it.
Yep, and making sure that you're still getting enough calories and not being in too much of a calorie restriction.
Yeah. I apologize if we touched on this, but I feel like we totally skipped over it. We talked about how what we normally see is people use that as just an excuse to skip breakfast. But I've lost track of how many people, actually, there's this one client at the clinic I used to work with. She was so excited about intermittent fasting. Like this woman, she was a little bit older too. She was probably in like her 60s, but she thought she found like the best diet ever. 'Cause she's like, I could literally eat whatever I want as long as I'm eating in this window. And so I'm trying to like, I had to like break her heart to tell her like, it still matters what you eat, right? And it's not only like, she not only had weight loss goals, but she had health goals. And so the quality of your food still matters.
Right.
no matter what time you're eating it, right? So for some people, you can like if you're eating more of those processed foods, you might not actually be in that calorie restriction, right? So you may not actually see the benefits there. So that's just another thing I see those people saying like, oh, if I'm intermittent fasting, I can eat whatever I want. I feel like we have started to move away from that, but I still think it's important to point out quantity and quality of food still matter.
Yep, absolutely.
Anything else that you wanted to add? I feel like we covered our basis. I feel like this is a popular topic for sure. It's been popular for a while, but if you have any more questions for us, anything else you want to expand on, please, of course, reach out on Instagram at dietitian Caitlin and dietitian Haley. We're always happy to chat. Anything else you want to add?
Nope, that's it. We'll see you next week.
All right.